All right, well, 4 minutes after the supposed time, so we'll wait a little bit as people are getting settled, and then we'll get started. This three set of classes is meant to be an intro track, and so today is what's classical about classical Lutheran education. Tomorrow is what's Lutheran about classical Lutheran education, and then our last day will be the pedagogy of that. So if you know classical, this can be a refresher or it can be old hat. If you don't, it can be new. There's a lot of stuff to get through, so this is really just the tip of the iceberg. An hour is not really enough, but hopefully it'll get your appetite whetted or give you places to go. If you want a copy, I can give if it's easier to read, this is my email, and I can send it to you if you wish. I've got the first two of these. Okay. What's classical about classical Lutheran education? In search of a positive definition. This first installment of our three-part series focuses on the content and philosophy of the term classical. Tomorrow, we dive deeply into what it means to do this specifically as Lutherans, since many are doing classical education. And the final part is on pedagogy with Dr. Tallman, and it'll round out our primer on classical Lutheran ed. It's helpful to have a primer, a bank of terms and definitions handy when you are explaining to the parents of your school what your school's about, when you're talking to your congregation or your pastor or to your teachers or your colleagues, when you'd like to pursue this noble endeavor if you're not doing it already. What do you say? How do you say it? Defense of our faith, or of any position for that matter, is frequently made from the negative. In terms of church, pastors and laity will spend too much time and energy on not being Catholic or not being Protestant. They choose to defend against opposing views rather than defining what it actually means to be Lutheran. Like these popular attempts at Lutheran theology by pastors and laity, teachers and headmasters are often tempted to hold a merely defensive position when we define classical education. When we try to define it, what we do, who we are, too often we will work from this negative. You'll hear classical education is not progressive. It is not like public school. It is not Common Core. Defining terms in the negative, although it can be helpful if you want to know what isn't those things, it doesn't get us any closer to who we are. It just shows you who we are not and what we don't stand for, instead of saying what we do. The temptation to act defensively and define negatively is there, but we really don't have any reason to do this. Memories of glory days at Lutheran schools and even public schools, nostalgic reminiscences of education of a time gone by, they all leave us feeling as if we need to defend returning to traditional teaching methods, as if we're going to step on someone's toes. Add to this generations of Lutheran school teachers and staff, public school teachers and staff rooted deeply in our families, in our churches, and whenever one advocates for change, the premise is what was done before was wrong. It was bad. It was worse. How could you say that? Our assertive offense seems like an attack only meant to deprive current students of whatever the noble teachers of the past sought to give them. But classical Lutheran education isn't a novelty. It's not a fad. It's not an antiquated system of education that suits the fancy of a few enthusiasts. It's actually an inheritance. Not just any inheritance out of the panoply of choices available. It's our inheritance. Not only just as Lutherans, even though that's certainly true, but also as descendants of the fathers of Western civilization. Classical Lutheran education owes its existence chiefly then not to men, but to God, who creates natural law in mankind, who created absolutes in truth, in beauty, and the good. It has been handed down throughout the generations in non-Christian and Christian forms, and thanks to our Lutheran forefathers, whether we know it or not, we have the best and the clearest form. This classical Lutheran education is an inheritance worth discovering. It is worth embracing and delivering to future generations. It is an education that seeks to preserve what God would have mankind, and especially Christians, preserve in the world. It is a return to natural law, that a recognition that beauty and truth are not simply in the eye of the beholder, but they are creations and reflections of the Creator. Here, in the tradition that we call classical Lutheran education, we return to truth worth teaching. We return to objectivity. We teach that which exists outside of ourselves and of our experience and of our feelings in order to form ourselves and our experiences and our feelings, and especially those of our students. This is the periphery of classical education, at least in theory. It's objective. It's based in truth. It is an inheritance received through generations of mankind, enlightened and reformed by evangelical Christian doctrine. That's Lutheran. It is formative. It is part and parcel to the fabric of our humanity in a secular sense, and even more so in a theological sense, since ultimately we use this education to teach the eternal truths of the doctrine of the Church. It is formative in the fabric of our Christianity and of our understanding of living out the Lutheran faith. So what is classical about classical Lutheran education? How do we define it, especially if we don't have an hour or more in which to unpack and explore it? If we want to say something memorable, brief, and readily accessible, an elevator speech, what can we say about this education that many of us care so deeply about? Mrs. Cheryl Swope, who's not with us, provides this definition. A classical Lutheran education is a formative education designed to incline the child toward that which is true, good, and beautiful through the liberal arts and sciences, guided by the great literature, art, music, and ideas of Western civilization, all enfolded by the assurance of Christ Jesus as the eternal fulfillment of truth, goodness, and beauty for us. Again, a classical Lutheran education is a formative education designed to incline the child toward that which is true, good, and beautiful through the liberal arts and sciences, guided by the great literature, art, music, and ideas of Western civilization, all enfolded by the assurance of Jesus Christ as the eternal fulfillment of truth, goodness, and beauty for us. Classical Lutheran education is formative. It makes a mark, an impression upon both the student and the teacher. It hands over to the children the treasury of knowledge and wisdom worth preserving. It's not working on a blank slate, a tabula rasa of John Locke. It forms that which God has created. It forms thoughts and words and deeds of every child who learned from it in order to better equip them to love and serve their neighbor. Thanks. Not only does it incline children toward the true, good, and beautiful of education, but it also delivers this to them. A classical education takes the beauty of language, whether it be English or Latin or mathematics, the truth of logic, and the goodness of historical virtue, and it delivers it to the student. The teacher is the conduit, the master who learns the subjects to guide the student as a greater Virgil serving Dante, not into the depths of hell and up the mountain of purgatory, although that's what every school year seems like, but through life on earth, and then up to the heavens, through the teaching of the truth of the gospel, which is what actually happens. Children are formed by this education. They are inclined toward truth, toward good, toward beauty. These attributes are handed to them through the subject matter. These subjects take the forms of the liberal arts and the sciences, and these divisions are a credit to the inheritance from antiquity, from Greece and Rome, through the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, through the likes of Cassiodorus and Augustine, through the Middle Ages, through the 16th century, especially with Luther and Melanchthon, through the 19th century with Walther at Alii until now. These liberal arts, the artes liberales, the free arts, are the subjects, so to speak, that prepare mankind to be truly free, to think, to write, to communicate, and operate in the world, contributing to the community and to society. These will all be unpacked later more fully. But the arts have been divided in twain historically: the trivium, the three language arts, the three ways, and the quadrivium, the four mathematical arts, the four ways. They are the bulk of the content delivered throughout primary and secondary education. The trivium is often held in higher regard, and it's meant to mold the mind to understand language and the mouth to communicate eloquently. The quadrivium, taught later on, develops students in the language of numbers. The liberal sciences are not what you're thinking, and they are often forgotten as subject matter for a bygone system of medieval education. But the liberal sciences, philosophy, theology, and law, or moral science, are laudable categories of knowledge for all mankind to be versed in, although you frequently will not be teaching all three in kindergarten. These were often offered later, generally at the bachelor's and master's levels, and to fewer students than the liberal arts, but they are worthy of note and discussion nonetheless if we want the clearest, and one should understand their fullest, explanation of a classical education. Literature, art, music, and ideas understand the humanities, guide the instruction of these arts and sciences. And it's not just any literature, art, music, and ideas that do the trick. The ones that we use are the products of Western civilization, molded by the scriptures, by the musings and writings of Greeks and Romans, by the medieval and Renaissance scholars who connect us ad fontes to natural law, to objectivity. There is no ambiguous multiculturalism here in the halls of classical education. Our inheritance forms a bias, to be sure. It's not a bias to make us bigots or Westerners. Rather, a healthy bias is necessary. This morality, this way of thinking, is consistent with how God has made mankind. There are some who go beyond this. C.S. Lewis can certainly find traits of Western thought in Eastern thought, as he endeavors to discuss natural law as what he calls the Tao in the abolition of man. But Western civilization has most clearly embodied the morality and conscience of Christendom. Even if we take into account the morass of the Enlightenment, the ensuing generations of skeptics and modernists who sought to divorce themselves from this rich inheritance that we wish to lay claim to and preserve, Western civilization preserves Christian morality not only for the sake of posterity, but for the betterment of society. Mr. Swope's definition above ends with a poetic description of the Christocentric aspect of classical Lutheran education. Tomorrow, in the second segment, we'll handle this in great detail. So let us first unpack the treasures handed down to us through our forefathers in the thought and in faith, and with the makings of a definition in hand, let's see what content fits within our definition and what the content teaches us. First, the trivium. Most novices, experts, and enthusiasts have come across the trivium. That's the language arts of classical education. Whether you've heard it from Dorothy Sayers or from Doug Wilson or Dr. Veith, the trivium, the three ways, are the higher arts, the arts of language, that prepare students to be truly eloquent and discerning in their reading, their writing, and their speaking. They are grammar, dialectic, most popularly known as logic, and rhetoric. They are taught as singular courses in many places, but they've also, since Dorothy Sayers, been utilized as stages of learning. Both avenues have their uses. For older students in secondary school, grammar, logic, and rhetoric can certainly be courses in their own rights, taught to develop writing and oratory. For the grammar school student, many concepts have to be learned before you can go straight into a logic class or a rhetoric class. So grammar, as an art, chiefly will deal with the grammar of language. It's Latin and English and others. And most classical schools will teach grammar as a distinct subject, mostly in English, in order to familiarize their students with how language works, although arguments can be made to go from Latin into English, since you have to learn it all there anyway. Specifically, grammar will teach how the English language functions in order to speak and to write more clearly. Since the classical revival of the mid-late 20th century, grammar also has turned into a stage of learning. one becomes familiar with the building blocks of any subject matter in what we call the grammar stage. It's where rote memorization, jingles, songs, they provide the bread and butter of mathematics, phonetics, sentence structures, Latin verb and noun endings, timelines, vocabulary terms, the books of the Bible, the chief parts of the catechism, skip counting, times tables. All these things fit in what one could call grammar. It's said to be found in everything that we learn. And so we learn it first to develop the content that we will order and discuss then in the dialectic or logic stage. And lastly, if we're trying to connect grammar to grades in school, as we commonly have them in our country, the grammar years are often thought of as kindergarten through 5th grade, with 5th being in both camps, as we'll go to next. Dialectic or logic, as it's often referred to, concerns itself with the ordering of thoughts. Many schools will offer classes in formal or material logic. Martin Cothran of Memoria Press has written numerous articles on logic and its significance, as well as the curriculum for Memoria Press. If you're looking at middle school logic classes or high school logic classes, I suggest looking at him. This is taught by Wittenberg Academy. Emmanuel Roswell used this for instruction. There's also Nance Wilson from Logos Press, which is a logic text. However, like grammar, logic also has been considered a stage, not just a subject, occupying aspects of 5th through 8th grade, understood as that weird thing of middle school or junior high. Here, students begin to assemble and order the building blocks of earlier education into forms like syntax and equations, translations and proofs, paragraphs. This is done in order to prepare the student to create, to write, to speak eloquently, to consider vice and virtue, philosophy and theology at a high level of comprehension. Rhetoric is the last of the language arts. It is the art of speaking well, the art of oratory. And Dr. Tallman is our residential expert and will not only share some of this in the final session, but in his standalone rhetoric section. Suffice to say, this is also a stage, not just a class on speaking. And it's sort of like the equivalent of high school. Knowing the material and ordering the material gives way to a creative and productive use of all the information taught to the students throughout the foundling years of learning. Few of us get to see this in action, since classical high schools are few and far between. Most often one sees K through 8, and this is where we hone our crafts and better ourselves. The ever-present task for many headmasters in schools is to determine how to approach that classical high school. Now, more exhaustive and specific treatments of the trivium exist. Littlejohn and Evans, in Wisdom and Eloquence, this is a very helpful little book which not only explains the trivium idea by idea and subject by subject, they're not really on the stage wavelength. That really is Dorothy Sayers and Doug Wilson. If you're looking at subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and other things that are considered subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, you'll find that in Littlejohn and Evans. And it's a really good book to read.
What's the name of it?
Littlejohn and Evans, Wisdom and Eloquence.
It's not a comprehensive curriculum, though. Don't go
No.
expecting that. It's
No.
a skeleton.
This is good to get your feet wet and to teach you a way of thinking about classical education that isn't talked of as much. It's one of my goals in this paper last year and this year to give more than just the trivium. Oftentimes we harp a lot on the trivium, and then we stop there, and we don't really talk about the rest. And there's a lot more that we've inherited than just the trivium. Not that there's anything wrong with it either. Wisdom and Eloquence gives a lot of emphasis on the quadrivium, not so much as stages, we'll talk about that in a minute, but as distinct subjects and now how we can understand that today. Sister Miriam Joseph's The Trivium is still on my reading list, but that's a whole book on that. I can't tell you much more than that I need to read it. And Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, and Doug Wilson's book of the same title talk about this stage mentality. Sayers is really where that comes from. So whenever you hear that, that's where they're drawing on from the 30s and 40s. Okay, quadrivium. By this point, most modern minds question the language-driven nature of classical education. What's with all this language stuff of grammar, logic, and rhetoric? Or you'll get the perennial question, what good will all this do for me? For a brief but significant treatment on that, the utility of the useless, see an article in Logia from 2012. the usefulness of useless knowledge. Defending classical liberal education from Melanchthon to Newman. The whole issue is a reprint of papers given at the First Lutheranism in the Classics. Shameless plug, go to that when you can at Fort Wayne. It's one of the greatest conferences besides ours. It's really excellent in our own circles. There are plenty of great conferences outside of us. But if you're looking for Lutherans doing this, go to Lutheranism in the Classics. Frankly, all these questions about language and acting as if it's not useful come from ignorance. Well-educated people speak and write well. Sorry, that's just the truth. They communicate effectively, and in doing so, they care about tradition and posterity. This language emphasis doesn't mean that math and science, as we know them, are foreign to classical education. They just have their own balance, their own place in the arts. They are arts, just like the trivium, and we call the mathematical arts the quadrivium. Traditionally, they are four. Arithmetic, that's number. Geometry, number in space. Music, number in time. And astronomy, number in space and time. Littlejohn and Evans expand this to include the following modern subjects. So they see arithmetic as elementary math through algebra, statistics, calculus, computer science as expansions of that art. For geometry, they see plane and solid geometry, geography, and the visual arts to be an expansion of that art. For music, theory, history, performance, appreciation, and dance and sport to be an extension of that art. And astronomy to really be where the natural sciences as we understand them fit, geology, chemistry, physics, and biology. Some of these categorizations may seem a stretch. Littlejohn and Evans have a different purpose when they outline their understanding of the liberal arts than the other commentators. They see the trivium, as I mentioned, in a similar fashion. Each category has subjects in it, as opposed to stages. Nonetheless, the quadrivium is an important part of the liberal arts. Think about the importance of simple and complex mathematics, of music, of astronomy, and even the natural sciences, if we concede to those previous categories. They are significant, but generally manifest themselves at higher grades in primary and secondary schools. Frequently, the quadrivium is not treated in its own right. One hears of it less. Many teach the subjects outlined above or offer courses that mirror them, though. Perhaps our frequent omission of a discussion of the quadrivium rather, is out of ignorance. And I think it also sometimes is from a fear of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which is like the quadrivium of the moderns. And many in classical education seem to shy away from these things, or at least just aren't interested. They care about language, math's okay, but STEM has taken this on. This movement was born in the late 90s and really presents itself as a foil to classical education. Just go look at Wikipedia, as taboo as that is, and see how global STEM is. All the different STEM programs in all the different countries of the world, how it focuses in schools, in extracurricular activities, and it's unfavorable towards the overt language focus of classical education. There's no real room for language. What's good is reading and writing as long as you can be an engineer, right? And so it's squashed, the other side, as opposed to how we get characterized. The goal of these programs is jobs, more engineers, more scientists, but oftentimes they are created to their disadvantage, lacking language skills, fostered in a full liberal arts classical education. The curriculum of the classical Lutheran school should have both the trivium and the quadrivium, for these together are the liberal arts. It does no good for us to pit one against the other. As this essay hopes to point out, more time should be given to developing a place of the quadrivium in today's classical Lutheran school. Perhaps even a whole discussion on what subjects really mean and how you teach those things is worth having at some point. Now, especially because oftentimes public school will water these down into math and reading instead of language arts, mathematical arts, since there's much more really to do. The liberal arts are not the only categories of subject matter to be grasped in classical education. There are the liberal sciences, which don't register in our mind as sciences anymore. Originally, the sciences were fields of knowledge, not fields of experimentation and testing. If you want to know more about that, there's a really neat book that I just read by Christopher Harrison. Territories of Science and Religion. It's from Chicago Press. It's very fascinating and looks at the history of the terms religio, religion, and scientia, and tries to trace how our notions of religion and science came to exist and what's really at play there. So if that fascinates you, it's called Territories of Science and Religion. Christopher Harrison. They were lectures a few years ago in Edinburgh, turned into a book. And if you like the lectures, you can find them online too. They're still there. And you can watch him. He's from Australia. But the book is excellent and really thought-provoking. He's not Lutheran. He's not a classical Lutheran educator. But what he says is really useful and helpful because everybody doesn't really know where those terms come from at all. Science comes from scientia. It means knowledge. It's from the verb scio, to know. And so sciences were fields of knowledge. They were threefold: philosophy, law, and the queen of the sciences, theology. The zenith of these was in the High Middle Ages, and so you'll find much of it in scholasticism, like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure and those persons. Philosophy, law, and theology were taught as the final culmination of studies in the university when you went to get your master's. And oftentimes this is really the best place for these subjects because they require high levels of fluency in the trivium, at least a competency in logic and rhetoric, and we should never, if we're talking high school or college or just our own education, it needs to be all three, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The downfall of the High Middle Ages and scholasticism was that it was all about logic. Logic became the end-all and be-all through Aristotle, as you'll hear in probably in other sessions. But one has to have all three, rhetoric being very significant in this task, and one that Lutherans really cared about a great deal due to humanism. So we'll hear little about them when we're dealing with most classical Lutheran endeavors because we've got kindergarten through 8th grade, and we're not really talking about philosophy and law. But they can find their homes in primary and secondary schools. Our schools should house good theology programs since the teaching of theology is part and parcel to a Lutheran education. That's kind of the point. So we should be fine there. Good scriptural and confessional catechesis is rooted in the classical philosophy of education, beginning with rote memorization in the defense, and then dialectical strategies of the catechism's questions and answers, culminating in the defense of the faith, mounted chiefly in daily vocation. So theology shouldn't be too hard. Philosophy will often be touched on in some parts of catechesis, certainly should come up in history and literature, and probably more at the end of middle school and in high school. Discussions of and lectures on law would most likely enter government and history classes if you're teaching American history at the middle school level and certainly high school, but this science is most for later high school and college classes. Regardless of when you get to teach them or learn about them, the true sciences, these fields of knowledge, are worthy endeavors, and they are a part of the education that we define as classical. Titular to the two previous and now the current conference of the CCLE are the attributes of goodness, truth, and beauty. These describe the nature of our education. They are embodied by its content. We do not assign and study just any books written within the confines of the history of Western civilization, or any art or any music. Literature ought to be good and written with an eye towards exploring the truth. When discussions arise concerning art and music, sport and dance, there is an objective line where beauty is found or it is not. The world around us has constantly been tempted by relativity, ever many truths. Ever since Eve saw that the fruit of the tree of knowledge was of good and evil was pleasing to the eyes, man has been attentive to the voice of the serpent. Did God really say? So mankind would prefer to abandon objectivity for a level of subjectivity in knowing what is good and evil. For me, instead of embracing life, we enjoy flirting with death. And a good classical education, a true classical education, exposes life and death, goodness and evil for what they truly are, and teaches children in their education to discern questions of existence, of the good and the true, of life and of death, of vice and virtue, of God and the devil. The applications of these three terms are endless, and as they continue to be explored in our conferences, but in the literature of classical educators and participants in the great dialogue of Western civilization. Even so, they are worth considering when discussing what's classical, because it gets us closer to the heart of the definition. Now, a brief history, and I mean brief. Classical education wasn't born in a vacuum. The contents and attributes of it were not designed in a boardroom or by a foundation in order to better education carried out by the government. Classical Lutheran education is the product of history, of thought and reason, of the quest for truth and goodness and beauty. It is a product of the nature of man to create and to reflect the creation of the Creator. Natural law ties all mankind together, whether they like it or not, Christians and pagans. The virtuous pagans of Greece and Rome sought to educate their boys to form them into respectful, responsible, thoughtful, and conscientious men. From classical Greece, through the Roman Republic, the foundations of classical education can be found in Plato and Aristotle, in Cicero and Quintilian. The act of training young men in Latin grammar, in dialectic, in oratory, in civics is no recent task. It was crafted through the period of antiquity, preserved even through the barbarous raids and sacks of the Roman Empire. The 4th century produced Aelius Donatus, whose Latin grammar would survive well into the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and is a required textbook in the 1536 or so school order from Brunswick. In the Chemnitz volume, you'll find Donatus listed right there. And you can look him up online, too, and you'll find a free copy somewhere of Donatus, and it's all question and answer. It's in Latin, sorry, but question and answer. How many parts of speech are there? Name them. Back and forth, back and forth. They've been using that since the 4th century. Cassiodorus, Boethius, St. Augustine, all figures worth knowing from the late 5th and 6th centuries, whose works provide Christian foundations for the medieval growth of classical education. Even the scholastics, which most Lutherans will malign, like Peter Abelard and Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, are branches of this genealogy of which classical Lutheran education is a descendant. But as I mentioned before, the earliest fathers of classical Lutheran education praised rhetoric and grammar. The High Middle Ages and scholastics lauded logic over the others. And this led the church into dark places, far away from the light of the gospel, especially under the influence of nominalism. The theology of the Western Church was bogged down in sophistry. That's trying to be smart, but not really being smart. Plausible but false arguments derived from mixing the philosophy of the pagans with the truth of the Scriptures. Thankfully, God is gracious, and the Renaissance and Reformation brought new life into classical education. It brought the gospel. The liberal arts and sciences received their due, but the queen of the sciences, theology, was lauded as the true purpose of such an education. Reading the Scriptures and knowing Christian doctrine became the aim of an education which was founded in Donatus, Virgil, Cicero, Aesop, et al. Education was for the purpose not of knowledge strictly or of introspection, but of serving the neighbor. And through the establishment of schools throughout the Lutheran territories, classical education survived the Renaissance, and it lasted throughout the plagues of Enlightenment and rationalism. And for more here, go to Luther and see his treatises to the councilmen of all cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools. That's in volume 45. And a sermon on keeping children in school from 1530. That's in 46 in Luther's works. We received this treasure in the States, in large part due to the Saxon migration of the 1830s. And if you haven't read this, you should, because Lutheran education will tell you that story. And we'll show you a great deal of the things that we've been talking about here and we'll go into tomorrow. Excellent volume. You should get it so you can read it or have it read to you when you're flying or driving or something, but it's worth having in your library. There is much in there about this topic and the inheritance historically we've had as classical Lutheran education. This history is important of what we strongly support and encourage throughout our schools, our churches, and our families. So, quo vadis, where do we go from here? We have spent much time on the classical education. We have shown how its roots and history are intertwined with the Christian church, but it hasn't stopped secular classical schools from opening, charter schools and the like. It also hasn't stopped our own Lutheran schools from abandoning what we are learning about, from classical philosophy, from curricula that teach these things. The aims which constituted part of our forefathers' reasons for leaving Germany and sailing to the Atlantic, over the Atlantic to New Orleans and settling in Missouri. What good is a classical education on its own? It certainly inclines children towards civil righteousness. It teaches citizenship and morality. It forms the conscience and mores. It teaches good, true, and beautiful things. But does this save? Is this the kind of righteousness that justifies us before God? Is it the only goal that we have in educating our children, that they will be moral and kind? Classical education alone lacks the righteousness which saves. Mrs. Swope, knowing this truth, concludes the definition that we have used with these words. The content of classical education is all enfolded by the assurance of Jesus Christ as the eternal fulfillment of truth, goodness, and beauty for us. Note that term of atonement there at the end. This is most certainly true. A truly classical and Lutheran, and we should understand Christian, but we use Lutheran because all Lutherans are Christians, properly understood. Not all Christians are Lutheran. And so don't be ashamed, as we'll go in great depth tomorrow, sort of a rabble-rousing sort of speech, that we need to be Lutheran and not just offer classical Christian education, but classical Lutheran education, because classical Christian education will not guarantee that the children get the gospel. And that's the whole reason why we're here. If we're not, then we can just go be Virgil. But since we aren't Virgils, as I say here, right, Virgil couldn't get into heaven. Virgil had to stop at the top of purgatory, which we thankfully only have to experience here and not later, right? So the truly classical and Lutheran education primarily exists to deliver the gospel. But it delivers it not only through means, but for the purpose of the means by which God uses us in the world. Tomorrow we'll go into great detail with regards to the Lutheran character of education. Apart from this, we will just train Ciceros and Virgils. And there's merit there, but not merit worthy before God. Like I said, Virgil didn't have faith. Heaven is no place for pagans who lack faith in the Son. A truly classical Lutheran education equips children for heaven, for the new heavens and the new earth, by equipping them to live as Christians on earth today. It provides them with knowledge of heavenly and earthly things to form them and craft them into their vocations, whatever those may be. What is classical about classical Lutheran education? It is rooted in the wisdom and truth of the past, the liberal arts and sciences and humanities, which teach us about mankind as it really is, sinful, and yet still aspiring to virtue, given us only through faith in Christ. It is a gift from our forefathers in both our earthly genealogies, Western Civ, and heavenly genealogies, the Church Triumphant. A classical education delivers the truth to our children, that in the face of such relative mores and realities, and destructive ones at that, in spite of mankind's fickle spirit that throws away its inheritance as quickly as it seems a little too worn and something else seems desirable, we might continue to preserve the objective truth, goodness, and beauty of the things worth fighting for. And so that really is the surface of what is classical, about classical Lutheran education. God willing, we'll all get to spend a lifetime learning more and doing more with it. Tomorrow we dive deep into what is Lutheran about classical Lutheran education and explore the most important pillar of this great education we strive to provide for our children, for our church, for our communities, and for the sake of the gospel. Thank you. We have some time, so are there any questions, considerations, clarifications? Say it better, say it different, don't say it again. Or nothing, and you can have an early. Yeah.
Just let me make an assumption that everybody here is not currently in a school that has classical education in place, classical Lutheran education.
Well, not everyone. There's a number of people who do and are sort of...
I mean, there are some that don't.
Sure.
So those are the people I'm talking about, which would include me,
Mm-hmm.
okay, at this point. This is probably the most detail I've heard at this point And how do you start? What's the starting point? What do you need to understand? On behalf of those others, and maybe a sensitivity to them who are just starting it, the nuts and bolts of communicating to a faculty, to a group of parents, to boards of education and a congregation, that this is the absolute way to go, and the time period this may take to transition. The phases of that, does that make sense? The building blocks of that transition are huge to us.
How to do that?
Yeah.
Well,
so it doesn't even take an answer necessarily.
No.
At this point, just maybe some direction, maybe some words of encouragement in terms of getting that from people that have already been there.
Sure.
I went to the conference in Pittsburgh 2 weeks ago, okay? And I stood up in front of 500 people and introduced myself, and I said I just had my knees replaced in October last year, and I can kneel down now, and that's how you remember. Neil, you'll know my name. Robotic device, Neil Casper. So if any of you have started and are on your way and give me any feedback in these next few days while I'm here, I would welcome it. Okay? And I did that in front of that audience as well, and about 12 people knew my name. So that was kind of
well, you helped them.
But yes, so anything that I can get would be helpful at this point. This is my first to this conference.
Great.
And thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome. Well, I'm glad you're here. But
yeah, those are, what you're doing is perfect for me right now.
Great.
So I can actually a little bit, even though he doesn't even probably remember me, I had him in college 100 years ago. But we just started a Lutheran school 3 years ago, and we leaned heavily. And so it was a little bit easier for us because we didn't have the history to fall, that we had to get away from.
Yeah.
But we relied heavily
It'll
on
be in
those
there.
schools that are classical. And they were very open to sharing curriculum, sharing ideas, letting us come see them coming to see us. They're wonderful resources that we need to, they've been down that road, they know how to do that. And rely heavily on any of those people around you that have been down that road.
Well, and one of the best positives of this conference is the networking. You'll meet everyone who is where you are, or was where you are, or may be eventually where you are, and you can talk with them and figure things out. And it's always going to be different. What we stand for always is the same. So every town is different. Every factor you're dealing with is different. Sometimes you can just get away with the fact that since public schools in your area are so darn terrible, you can just say, we have the best school here, and then prove it, and then they come. I mean, that's really, sometimes it can be as simple as that. If you're in good public school area, then you've got to be a little more crafty. Yeah, Tom? And,
Yeah, I just wanted to say the two places where you'll have a chance to have that discussion will be the 2:15 session on Thursday with Reverend Keyser, and 5:30 tonight with, 4:30 tonight with Dr. Jackie.
One in the back.
My sister-in-law teaches in 4th or 5th grade at a Lutheran school that's definitely gotten away from being even Lutheran in identity. And some of the things that I talked about with her were just simply, it can seem really daunting, but they assign books in 5th grade to read. Start assigning classical books and moving towards and things like that. If they have to do memory work or writing, have them do it from the scriptures.
Yeah.
Rather than just random memorization of secular poets.
Yes. Well, and there's a place for secular poetry after you know the scriptures and the catechism. Rudyard Kipling's pretty phenomenal. And there are lots of great things you can do in secular poetry. But we shouldn't, right? They aren't our muses. We don't need them. We have the Holy Spirit. We have the scriptures. And the nice thing about classical Lutheran education, like the Lutheran faith in general, is it really isn't rocket science. It isn't. It's very simple. All you have to do is submit that you don't know anything, just like we submit that we can't save ourselves and we're going to hell. And so we receive faith, and we receive life, and we go into class and we receive knowledge. And it's really pretty simple. The problem is we're also gosh darn braggadocious and proud that we were raised the right way, and our parents can't be wrong, and neither can my Lutheran teacher, and neither can my professor, that we can't we'll use the term tomorrow, incurvatus in se. We are so turned in on ourselves and navel-gazing that we've lost sight of anything. So if you can have an honest discussion and say, look, just read a good book. Read Charlotte's Web. And read Narnia. Read good things, and you'll figure it out eventually. Or just talk to people. There are plenty of lists. The nice thing is now you're all, depending on where you are in a much better place than ever before. And every day since today will always be a better place for resources in classical Lutheran education. The publishing houses are making things we can use. It doesn't all have to be done in your garage or in the workroom. You can actually buy things. Now, Lutheran stuff we still need to care a great deal about, and we can't always buy it. But Pastor Bender, Concordia Catechetical Academy is a great place to start. But you, yes, the resource books show us a lot, and they keep getting bigger. That's the second edition, right? So there's more things in there. You're not alone. We're not all trying to reinvent the wheel at the same time. And if you feel like you are, stop it and talk to somebody you met here so you can rediscover the wheel together, because it already exists. It's already there for you to use.
What is the primary role of parents in this classical education?
Everything. You are the extension of them.
Correct.
In loco parentis, right? In place of the parent, which is why you've got to be a good salesman in order to teach them what they really want.
I understand that part, but would it be more primarily in the grammar stage?
No, everywhere.
They could go on up.
Yeah, they should. I mean, you'd hate to raise parents to be the ones who say, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you anymore." So, and I won't tell you a funny anecdote about my great aunt, but nonetheless, we want to take them with us. We want to raise the parents up with us. If you have opportunities to invite them to certain classes, like Latin, if you offer Latin at a time when a parent can show up, or have somebody who's free after school to give classes and instruction in Latin, that's the number one place where you're going to find parents saying, "I can't do anything, sorry." Most parents can read, and most parents can add, subtract, divide, and multiply, and find certain places on maps and things. So we're okay with the subjects that they probably learned something of. And many parents, depending on where they grew up, might have an affinity for the things you're doing. They might say, "Oh, that's how I learned." Now, more and more so, we won't find that. But there are some who do. Say, "Oh, phonics, yeah, I remember that." But it's hit or miss. So you want them involved. They need to be involved. You can do the homeschool thing, but for the most part, everybody is used to shipping off their children to school. And although that's not the best all the time, it's what Luther understood. Parents are busy doing parent things. And we are an extension of the parental office as pastors and teachers doing these things. We are mom and dad, as you get called, right? We are for them, those hours of the day. And so it's our job to instruct and to form, which is why it's also important to have agreements with the parents, right? Make your Lutheran statement of faith in your handbook incredibly explicit. Go over it, pastors, with those people, headmasters. Don't let them pass by the admissions stage without understanding that you're Lutheran. At Roswell, we have a summary of the first 13 articles of the Augsburg Confession as the statement of faith, and I read them with every person out loud. We also required in our area, in New Mexico, that one parent had to be a Christian in order to send their kids to the school. And because of that, there was a lot more congeniality. It actually felt like one big family. We're an extension of you, you're an extension of us, sort of thing. Depending on where you live, right? That isn't the case in Houston. That would be different where I am now. But in Roswell, you could do that, and they appreciated it. Now, you'll say, what about the heathens we want Jesus to save? Well, you make exceptions if they're willing to play by the rules. You don't want to let in all the Mormons and Buddhists who won't attend chapel because they need to attend chapel. So that's what you do at the school. But we'll do that tomorrow. All right, overtime. Yep. So goodbye. See you tomorrow.